that's the end. I was enjoying myself. I was like, oh, this story stuff's like pretty cool. It's like it's like a high level of production. It's fun. It's funny. It's bombastic. Those were my impressions immediately after finishing the story of Suicide Squad Kill the Justice League. But long before this unfortunate realization, I wondered if Suicide Squad really was as bad as people made it out to be. I heard a lot of critiques that I found to be dumb or misguided. Suicide Squad isn't accurate to the comics. The Justice League would never lose to such pathetic characters. Rocksteady have tarnished Batman and the Arkham games. The game is woke. They made a woman more powerful than she should be. So I played through the game, and after playing it, what I found was a soulless live service game with bits and pieces of a great story, uninteresting combat, and a super shallow open world. The story in this game is almost great. There were many moments where I was questioning myself more than usual on if a scene was good because of all of the discourse surrounding this game. The actors were all doing their jobs well, and it made the characters seem so charismatic. The animation made the characters come to life. The writing didn't take itself too seriously, which allowed needed levity in what otherwise would have been an overly intense or abrasive story. The scenes were shot in a way that foreshadowed what would happen without making moments feel cheap. So what could make the story bad, I thought? Well, Fight Against Brainiac will continue in season 1 and beyond. The story does not have a satisfactory conclusion. The first 80% of this 11-ish hour story was genuinely a lot of fun to sit through, but that doesn't abolish the absolute bullshit that takes place near the end of the story. Without talking specifics, the story felt thrown away in favor for artificially extending the lifetime of this game. I mean, it's a live service game that's meant to be played for tens of hours, hundreds of hours, even thousands of hours over many years, right? Maybe that's what they intended, but there are plenty of examples of how to extend or further allude to future story beats without abolishing all of the story material up until that point. It starts out as a charismatic, funny, bombastic action movie, but it ends up being a soulless experience that felt void of life by the end. Sadly, the story wasn't the only thing that felt void of life after playing many hours of this game. The combat in Suicide Squad Kill the Justice League lacks the required depth for a live service game. It blows me away that there are elements that encourage you to continue to play around with this combat after finishing the story of this game. Let's talk about how the combat is structured. It's a third-person shooter that has light RPG elements. You pick a character that each has their own designated skill tree and traversal mechanic. You shoot enemies, counter their attacks, dodge their attacks, close gaps with interesting movement, and then melee enemies after closing those gaps. After playing through the game and unlocking more abilities through your skill tree, you can also interact with combat in different ways using the abilities that you've unlocked with the skill tree. These different tools at your disposal are also accompanied by passive skills through the skill tree. And I think I'm implying that there is a level of depth to the combat, because I guess like there is, but every combat encounter that you engage in is awfully shallow. The environments that you fight enemies in is fun to travel around in at first because of the interesting movement mechanics, but quickly become tiresome as you realize they're all pretty much the same thing with slightly different visuals. The enemies that you encounter are incredibly dull. Instead of giving a large variety of enemies to face, you're almost always given the same handful of enemy types to mow down with your weapons. And these enemy types feel like what would be equivalent to fighting a training dummy in a different video game. But they come in large hordes, and there are occasional mechanics that you have to engage with. And the side missions do not alleviate any of the perceived monotony. You're forced to do what feels like the same encounters over and over again that you already experienced through the main story, with different affixes to change things up. And these different affixes, instead of feeling innovative or liberating or even challenging or interesting, feel very constricting. Sometimes its enemies can only be damaged by critical hits. Other times you can only damage them with grenades. To just remix the content that you already did in the main story as a form of side content feels pretty bad, which make it crazy to me that this is a live service game. How are players supposed to feel encouraged to do this content over and over and over and over again if it isn't already super engaging in the first place? Well, I mean, usually in live service games or MMO-like experiences, you're often incentivized to do things through the promise of loot. But Suicide Squad even fails at that. The itemization in this game is fucking awful. The different pieces of loot can sometimes get cool effects that change how you approach combat. Not that it matters, because the enemies are a bunch of training dummies that sometimes require you to engage with specific mechanics, but more often than not, you'll get a procedurally generated piece of equipment that doesn't leave an impact after being equipped. There are so many pieces of equipment and resources that are left to rot in your inventory because of having virtually no use. And it's crazy to me that after you finish the story of this game, the end game is just a further remixing of content that you've already done, but it's fine. It's cool now because you're able to get better loot. Like, why the fuck do I care about getting better loot if almost none of it has been satisfying up until this point, or if all of the other content in this game has felt relatively shallow? Oh, and like also in the end game, you can make other charts and numbers go up. But again, like, why do I care? It's a live service game without any real satisfying combat. I mean, I guess, like, if the enemies were more varied, it'd be all right. But every single environment is the exact same. And what you do during every single combat encounter mechanically on your controller or on your mouse and keyboard feels virtually the same, regardless. I mentioned earlier that the story fumbled the bag near the end. So what about the other large aspect of the game, the world? Maybe there's a sense of discovery. Could that save this experience and make me want to play this game for tens of hours? No. The open world is a large metropolitan city in which every single building sort of blurs together by the time that you finish the game. And as I alluded to earlier, most of the events that you're able to partake in this open world are pretty tiresome after doing them a couple times. And if those events weren't tiresome enough, the entire city is infested with a bunch of enemies that you've already killed hundreds of times, thousands of times by the end of this game. There isn't any real reason to explore the city. Sure, the traversal is pretty fun, and different characters having different forms of traversal is pretty great. The character classes aren't incredibly diverse from each other, but the traversal mechanics being unique to each character is cool. But that doesn't matter when there are no points of interest for me to get to travel to. I don't think the mechanics are enough to warrant me playing around like I'm in a giant sandbox. There aren't any interesting combat encounters to encourage you to go out of your way, and the rewards feel so pointless. There are undoubtedly a lot of other issues with this game that I could bring to light, but I feel like I've said enough to let you guys know why this game isn't very good. I have no clue what it was like developing this game, but there are glimpses of talent and passion woven throughout this game that seem to be overshadowed by corporate greed. I feel bad giving this game a number out of 10, but it's like a 4 or 5 out of 10, man. I don't know. Let's do 5.